In the sterile halls of forensic science, Dr. Alani Sharma built her career debunking the impossible. Spontaneous human combustion? Just folklore, ancient superstitions, primitive ignorance. But when a man burns to ash in his living room, leaving only his shoes behind, and the bones show temperatures exceeding 1500 degrees while newspapers sit untouched mere feet away, everything she believed crumbles. Some mysteries don't want to be solved. They want to consume you. The lecture hall was silent, save for the crisp, confident voice of Dr. Alani Sharma. On the massive screen behind her, a gruesome, sepia-toned photograph from the 19th century showed what was left of a man in a chair. He was little more than a blackened torso and a pile of ash. The term spontaneous human combustion is a relic, Dr. Sharma said, her voice cutting through the hushed awe of the forensic science students. She paced before the lectern, a sleek, modern figure against the archaic horror on the screen. It's a ghost story, born from an age before we understood the simple, brutal chemistry of fire. People love a mystery. They crave the inexplicable. But our job is not to indulge in folklore. Our job is to reveal the scientific reality, however mundane it may seem. A red dot from her laser pointer danced on the screen. What you are looking at is not a supernatural event. It is a tragic, but perfectly explainable phenomenon known as the Wick effect. Her words were precise, each one a brick in the wall of logic she was building for her students. Imagine a candle. You have wax the fuel and a wick. In the human body, particularly in cases involving individuals with a high percentage of body fat, the body itself provides the fuel. The victim's clothing acts as the wick. All it takes is a small external ignition source, a dropped cigarette, a spark from a fireplace, an overturned lantern in the case of our 19th century friend here. She clicked to the next slide, a diagram illustrating a human silhouette with arrows showing the flow of heat. Once ignited, the clothing begins to smolder. The subcutaneous fat melts, soaking into the fabric of the clothes. This creates a slow-burning, low-temperature fire. It is not a raging inferno. It is a smolder. It can go on for hours, consuming the torso where the majority of body fat is concentrated, while leaving the extremities, and often the rest of the room, curiously untouched. She looked out at the sea of faces, seeing her certainty reflected back at her. There is no mystery. There is no fire from within. There is only fabric, fat, and a tragic accident. Science does not leave room for ghosts. Later that day, in the sterile quiet of her office, that certainty felt like a fortress. Textbooks lined the walls in perfect order. Awards gleamed under recessed lighting. It was a room that reflected her mind, organized, rational, and free of clutter. The face of Detective Miles Corbin on her monitor was the only thing out of place. He looked tired, his brow furrowed in a way that spoke of a deep, elemental confusion that no amount of procedure could resolve. "I'm telling you, Alani, I've never seen anything like it," he said, his voice raspy over the laptop's speakers. "I've been a cop for 30 years. I've seen house fires, gas explosions, terrible things. This wasn't that." He rubbed his eyes. "Honestly, it looks like one of those spooky stories. The guy just burned up, but nothing else did." Sharma leaned back in her chair, a faint, indulgent smile on her lips. It was the same story. Every time a small-town cop got out of his depth. "It is the Wick effect, Miles," she said, her tone gentle, as if explaining a complex concept to a child. "It is always the Wick effect. Let me guess. Elderly victim, probably a smoker, fell asleep in his favorite armchair." On the screen, Corbin shook his head slowly. The movement was heavy with contradiction. "That is the thing. He's a young guy. 40s maybe, and there's almost nothing left of him." He paused, and his next words seemed to hang in the air between their two worlds. Just his feet. The smile vanished from Sharma's face. She leaned forward slightly. The professional armor was still in place, but a hairline crack had appeared. Feet were extremities. They had less fat. According to the Wick effect model, they should be among the last things to be consumed, if at all. It was an expected outcome, but the way Miles said it, the sheer, unvarnished strangeness in his voice prodded at her professional curiosity. It was a piece that didn't quite fit the puzzle. It was an anomaly. And Dr. Alani Sharma hated anomalies. The apartment was suffocatingly normal. That was the first thing that struck her. There was no acrid smell of a major blaze, no film of soot on the bland beige walls. A stack of newspapers sat on a cheap coffee table, the edges of the paper crisp and white. Through a doorway, she could see a tidy kitchen, a dish towel neatly folded over the handle of the oven. Then she saw it. In the center of the living room, on a worn but otherwise intact rug, was a large ovular scorch mark, black as pitch. It was a contained island of destruction in a sea of mundane calm. And in the center of that island sat a pile of fine, greyish-white ash. It was shockingly small, no more than what might fill a shoebox, yet it was all that remained of a human being. All except for the feet. At the edge of the ash pile, placed with the bizarre neatness of a surrealist painting, were two human feet. They were still inside their socks, still laced into a pair of brown leather shoes. They sat there, perfectly, impossibly, untouched. It looked as though the man had been sitting there one moment, and in the next had simply evaporated out of his footwear. Dr. Sharma's breath caught in her throat. She pulled on a pair of latex gloves, her movements automatic, a trained response cutting through the sudden fog of disbelief. She knelt, her professional gaze sweeping the scene, her mind racing, trying to force the data into the framework of the Wick effect. Low temperature, long duration smolder. The words were hollow. The theory was a ghost. A low temperature fire hot enough to calcify bone, because that's what this fine ash had to be, would have taken hours, days even. It would have generated enough ambient heat to at least yellow the newspapers on the table, to melt the plastic remote control beside them, to stain the ceiling with a greasy pall of smoke. But there was nothing, no collateral damage, just a perfect, tidy, impossible circle of annihilation. Her eyes moved from the ash to the pristine feet and back again. The confident lecturer from that morning, the woman who had so smugly dismissed the inexplicable, was gone. In her place was a scientist confronted with a phenomenon that spat in the face of her models. Her expression, once a mask of clinical certainty, shifted into a slow frown of dawning, horrified comprehension. The fortress of her logic had been breached. This wasn't a puzzle, it was a violation. The harsh fluorescent lights of the County Morgue small lab hummed, a monotonous sound that did nothing to soothe the chaos in Dr. Alani Sharma's mind. She had retreated to this sterile, predictable world of stainless steel and chemical analysis, a sanctuary of science against the impossible memory of what she'd seen in that apartment. Before her, on a clean metal tray, was a portion of the greyish-white ash. She worked with meticulous, almost robotic precision, her hands steady even as her thoughts reeled. She sifted the fine powder through a series of mesh screens, isolating minuscule fragments of bone. This was her process. This was control. She pressed the record button on her digital voice recorder, her voice coming out firm, clinical, a deliberate act of will. Preliminary findings, case 734. Victim, John Doe. Cause of death pending analysis. The scene is broadly consistent with the Wick effect. She paused. the lie feeling thick and heavy in her throat. A probable ignition source, likely a dropped cigarette, has not yet been recovered, but is presumed to have ignited the victim's clothing. The victim's probable high body fat content and the presence of synthetic fibers in the carpet provided sufficient fuel for a low-temperature, long-duration smolder. Every word was a carefully chosen brick, used to rebuild the fortress of logic that the crime scene had demolished. She was constructing the official narrative, the one that would fit neatly into a file, the one that would allow the world to make sense again. She was forcing the evidence to fit the theory, because the alternative was unthinkable. This was the demand of her worldview, the rigorous application of reason, even when it felt like a prayer against the dark. Night fell. The rest of the morgue went quiet, leaving Sharma alone with the humming lights and the silent testimony of the ash. The mass spectrometer, a machine she trusted as much as her own mind, had finished its analysis. She stared at the results on the monitor, and the numbers stared back, cold and defiant. Her breath hitched. The report was unequivocal. The bone fragments within the ash were calcined, heated to a degree that turned them into brittle, mineralized shadows. To achieve calcination requires temperatures in excess of 1500 degrees Fahrenheit, over 800 degrees Celsius. Her mind raced, a frantic cascade of logic and denial. Impossible. The Wick effect produces a slow, gentle fire, barely hotter than a barbecue. To generate this kind of heat, it would require a massive accelerant, a river of gasoline, or a furnace. It would have incinerated the entire apartment, melted the television, burned the newspapers to confetti, yet the room was pristine. Frustration, sharp and acidic, rose in her chest. It had to be a mistake, a contaminated sample, a machine in need of recalibration. She meticulously cleaned the sample holder, ran the diagnostic protocols on the spectrometer until it beeped its satisfaction, and loaded a new sample of the ash. She ran the test again, her eyes locked on the progress bar, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the desk. The machine whirred, clicked, and fell silent. The new report appeared on the screen. The numbers were identical. The fortress didn't just have a crack, it had been leveled by a cannonball fired from within. Her own science, her own infallible tools, were screaming that the one rational explanation was impossible. In the sterile anonymity of her motel room, Sharma felt a profound sense of isolation. She needed a sounding board, another mind, someone who could see the variable she was missing. She dialed the number of the one man whose intellect she had always considered a fixed point in the scientific universe, her former mentor, Dr. Marcus Thorne. When his familiar, charismatic face appeared on her laptop screen, she felt a momentary wave of relief. She laid out the case carefully, presenting the temperature anomaly not as a mystery, but as a complex scientific puzzle. Thorne listened, his expression impassive. When she finished, he didn't offer a theory. He didn't ask for the data. He simply smiled a thin, patronizing smile. "Alani," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're chasing ghosts. It's a contaminated sample from the scene or a faulty machine in some backwater lab. It happens. I ran the calibration twice, Marcus. The machine is clean, the sample. Then you were letting a weird scene get to you." He cut her off. "Don't let a bit of rural weirdness damage your credibility. The field doesn't need another crackpot spinning tales about mystery fires. Write it up as the Wick effect, note an unexplained temperature anomaly, and move on. It's the only professional thing to do." The finality in his tone was like a door slamming shut. He wasn't helping her solve a problem. He was telling her to bury it. The call ended, leaving Sharma staring at her own reflection in the dark screen. The sense of isolation was now complete. She had been rebuked, dismissed not as a colleague, but as a hysteric. She was utterly alone with an impossible truth. The next day, she went back. She told Detective Corbin she needed to do one final sweep of the apartment before releasing the scene. It was a lie. She didn't know what she was looking for, only that she couldn't let it go. The place was just as she had left it, silent and strange. On a whim, she ran her gloved hand down the side of the sofa cushions. Her fingers brushed against something hard and rectangular. She pulled it out. It was a small, cheap journal with a black cover. She opened it. The first page read, "Property of Liam Hennessy." The victim finally had a name. She flipped toward the end, where the handwriting grew shaky, almost frantic. The last few entries were a descent into terror. "It's starting again," he had written. "The buzzing inside my bones, like a loose wire. It gets so hot some nights. I have to sleep with the window open, even when it's freezing." Sharma felt a cold dread creep up her spine. She read the final entry, dated the day before his death. The ink was smudged, as if written with a trembling hand. "I can smell it now. That smell like rain on hot metal. It's the same smell Grandad Michael talked about. I am scared. I'm so scared I am going to burn up from the inside, just like he did." Sharma froze. The journal slipped from her fingers, falling open on the floor. "Burn up from the inside." The words echoed in the silent apartment, a direct quote from the heart of the superstition she had built her career on dismantling. It was the language of folklore, of campfire tales, of the pre-scientific dark, and it aligned perfectly with a spectrometer report that showed impossible furnace-like temperatures. The victim's subjective terror and the objective scientific data were telling her the exact same terrifying story. She was holding two pieces of a puzzle from two different universes, and they fit. Liam Hennessy's journal sat on the passenger seat, its terrifying words a silent companion as Dr. Alani Sharma drove. His mention of Grandad Michael was the only lead she had, a thread of superstition to pull on. It had led her here, away from the city, away from everything she knew. The ordered grid of the suburbs, with its clean sidewalks and identical houses, had given way to winding country roads that seemed to follow the old contours of the earth rather than impose a new logic upon it. Manicured lawns were replaced by overgrown fields. New construction gave way to weathered farmhouses and collapsed stone walls, half swallowed by ivy. The air itself felt different, thick with the smell of damp earth and wood smoke. It was a journey into a more ancient, mysterious world, a landscape that operated on rules of nature and time that felt alien to her. She was a creature of the laboratory, of controlled variables and sterile environments. Here, everything was uncontrolled, wild and deep, with a history she couldn't begin to analyze. She was leaving the safety of her known world, driving headfirst into the very heart of the folklore she had spent her life debunking. The address led her to a small, tidy house set back from the road. An old woman with eyes as sharp and clear as a winter sky answered the door. This was Maeve Hennessy, Liam's great-aunt. She led Sharma inside, into a living room that was the complete opposite of Sharma's own office. It was cozy, warm, and filled with the quiet artifacts of a lifetime of belief. A simple wooden crucifix hung on the wall. Small, woven charms were tucked into the frame of the doorway, and on the mantel sat a heavy, leather-bound family Bible, its cover worn smooth by generations of hands. Sharma sat on a floral sofa, gently explaining the reason for her visit. She broke the news of Liam's death with the careful, practiced empathy of a professional. Maeve listened, her expression calm, her hands resting peacefully in her lap. There was no shock, no outburst of grief. When Sharma finished, the old woman simply nodded, a slow, deep gesture of profound and sorrowful acceptance. "So the fire took another one," Maeve said, her voice soft but steady. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same finality one might use to say the sun had set. "It comes for one of us, every other generation. It's our family's sorrow." Sharma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. This wasn't the rambling of a superstitious mind. This was a historical account. "The fire?" Sharma asked, her clinical vocabulary failing her. "It is what we've always called it," Maeve explained, her gaze distant, looking at a history only she could see. "It is a heat that comes from within, a terrible, hungry thing. It took my brother Michael when I was just a girl, and his grandfather before him." The calm certainty in Maeve's voice was more unsettling to Sharma than any amount of hysteria could have been. A scientist seeks causes, mechanisms, predictable patterns. Maeve's worldview didn't seek to explain the fire. It simply endured it. It was a faith-based acceptance of a mystery, and it crashed against Sharma's scientific need for a cause with the force of a tidal wave. "My brother Michael," Maeve continued, her eyes finding Sharma S., that S who Liam was talking about in his journal. She rose slowly and went to the mantel, picking up the heavy family Bible. She brought it over and set it on the coffee table between them. With gentle, practiced hands, she opened the cover. Tucked inside were yellowed, brittle paper artifacts. The first was a newspaper clipping from a 1952 local paper. The headline read, "Cinderman Mystery Baffles Police." The article described the death of a 22-year-old man, Michael Hennessy, found in his locked room as a pile of ash, with only his work boots remaining. The details were shockingly, sickeningly identical to Liam's case. "He was a good boy," Maeve whispered, her finger tracing the headline. "He said he felt the buzzing for a week before it happened." Then, Maeve reached for an old, dusty shoebox on a bookshelf. She placed it on the table and removed the lid. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a single sepia-toned photograph. It was a police evidence photo, official, the date stamped in the corner. It showed a dark scorch mark on a bare wooden floor. In the center of the mark was a small pile of ash, and at the edge of the ash, pristine and untouched, sat a pair of laced-up work boots. It was the same scene. It was the exact same scene. The air left Sharma's lungs. Her professional composure, her scientific detachment, her entire worldview shattered in that instant. This wasn't a story. This wasn't a folklore passed down through generations. This was a documented, repeating, historical pattern of an impossible event. The photograph in her trembling hand was an artifact that existed in two worlds at once. It was empirical, physical evidence, the currency of her scientific world, of a phenomenon that belonged to the world of superstition. She could no longer dismiss the family curse as a narrative. She was looking at the data, and the data was terrifying. That night, sleep was impossible. The sterile quiet of her motel room felt like a cage. Sharma sat in the glow of her laptop, a woman torn in two. On the left side of her screen was the email she had to send to Dr. Thorne. She typed the words, each one a betrayal of the truth she had seen. Case 734, Death of John Doe, Liam Hennessy. Concluded as consistent with the Wick effect. Case closed. It was a neat, tidy lie, a piece of fiction to appease the dogma of the establishment. Then, with a click, she opened a new window on the right side of the screen. She created a new folder, burying it deep within her personal drive and encrypting it with a complex password. She stared at the blinking cursor, then typed the folder S name, Project Prometheus. She felt a surge of defiant energy. Prometheus had stolen fire from the gods and given it to humanity. She would steal the secret of this impossible fire from the darkness that held it. She began to work with a feverish intensity she hadn't felt in years. She uploaded a high-resolution scan of the 1952 photograph. She began building a detailed Hennessy family tree, pulling names and dates from the old Bible she had photographed with her phone. She started cross-referencing the names with online coroner's reports, public records, and historical archives, digging backward through time, hunting for more impossible deaths. She hit send on the email to Thorne, sealing the official lie, but her real work, her true investigation, was just beginning. She had crossed a threshold. She was no longer Dr. Alani Sharma, the pragmatist, the pillar of the scientific establishment. She was now an explorer, operating in the shadows, pursuing a terrifying truth. Alone. Project Prometheus was a descent, days blurred into nights, fueled by stale coffee and a consuming, obsessive need for an answer. Dr. Alani Sharma, the sharp, impeccably dressed scientist, vanished, replaced by a weary, disheveled woman hunched over a laptop in the perpetual twilight of a motel room. The hum of a university library's microfiche reader became the soundtrack to her life as she scrolled through brittle, decades-old death certificates. She traced the sprawling, complicated branches of the Hennessy family tree, matching birth dates with obituaries, her screen a chaotic web of digital ancestry databases and scanned public health records. She was hunting for a pattern, a ghost in the machine of history. For weeks, she found nothing but dead ends and tragic coincidences. Then, at 3 o'clock one morning, staring at the screen with burning eyes, she found it. It wasn't in the old, dusty records. It was in a modern, anonymized genetic database she'd gained access to, cross-referencing the DNA of a living Hennessy cousin from another state, a rare, unclassified mitochondrial DNA haplotype, a specific genetic signature passed down through the maternal line. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She worked backwards, cross-referencing the marker with what little genetic material she could find from other branches of the family tree. It was there. Every single family member whose death was recorded as an anomalous fire shared this identical, obscure piece of genetic code. It was a breadcrumb trail written in the language of biology. The family curse wasn't a story, it was an inheritance, coded into their very cells. She was staring at the first piece of modern science that didn't just support the folklore, it explained it. But a genetic predisposition was not a mechanism. She had a why, but she still didn't have a how. The ghost of the Wick effect still haunted the case file, the only officially accepted explanation. To move forward, she had to kill it for good. She called in favors, pulled strings she hadn't touched in years, and secured time at a state-of-the-art controlled burn facility. Behind a wall of reinforced glass, she watched her final, desperate experiment. A pig carcass, the closest biological analog to a human, was dressed in clothes and placed on a synthetic rug inside a sealed, instrumented chamber. This was her last-ditch effort to prove a natural explanation. First, she directed the technicians to replicate the Wick effect precisely. A small flame was introduced to the carcass S-shirt. It smoldered as expected, producing a greasy black smoke and a disgusting cloying smell. It barely charred the surface. After 2 hours, it was nothing but a blackened, greasy mess, a far cry from the fine, clean ash she'd found in Liam Hennessy's apartment. "It's not working," she said into the intercom, her voice tight with a frustration that bordered on fury. She had to replicate the result, not the theory. Increase the heat, add an accelerant. The technicians, looking unnerved, complied. They remotely pumped accelerant into the chamber and increased the temperature. The carcass was engulfed in a raging inferno. The instruments inside the chamber sparked and melted. The temperature skyrocketed past 2,000 degrees, and through the roaring flames, she saw the flesh and bone incinerate, turning to the fine white ash she remembered. But the fire was a monster, a wild, uncontrolled catastrophe that cracked the reinforced glass in front of her and set off every alarm in the facility. She watched her thesis literally go up in flames. To get the result she needed, she had to create the exact opposite conditions of the crime scene. She had now, with her own hands and with unwavering scientific rigor, proven that the official explanation was not just wrong, but laughably impossible. The theory was dead, and in its place, there was only a terrifying vacuum. That night, back in the motel room, the silence was deafening. The physical evidence had been exhausted. She had falsified the only rational theory. All that was left were the stories. She picked up the phone and dialed Maeve Hennessy. "Maeve," she said, her voice heavy with fatigue. "I need to ask you something else. The people in your family, before it happened, what did they feel? What were the symptoms?" Maeve's voice was a soft, steady whisper on the other end of the line. "They always complained of a fizzing feeling," she said. "A static in their blood. My brother Michael said it felt like his bones were vibrating, and they all mentioned the smell of rain right before a big storm." Sharma thanked her and hung up, her mind reeling. Static in their blood. It was poetic, meaningless, the stuff of superstition. She rubbed her tired eyes with the heels of her hands, trying to massage away the headache that had taken up permanent residence behind her temples. As she pulled her hands away from her face, it happened. She felt an odd tingling sensation in the fingertips of her right hand, a prickling, like a limb that had fallen asleep. She looked down. For a split second, a faint, impossible web of blue, static-like energy crackled over her skin, dancing between her knuckles before vanishing into nothing. She gasped, a sharp, choked sound. She shook her hand violently, as if trying to fling off something foul. Her mind scrambled for a rational foothold. Stress, exhaustion, a trick of the cheap fluorescent lights. But she knew what she had seen, and she knew what she had felt. A cold, absolute knot of terror tightened in her stomach, a fear so profound it was existential. The phenomenon was no longer an abstract puzzle in a lab. It was no longer a historical mystery or a genetic anomaly in others. It had crossed the line from observational to experiential. Her scientific detachment was gone, obliterated in a silent blue flash. The case wasn't just on her desk anymore. It might be in her blood. Terror is a powerful catalyst. The faint blue crackle on her own skin had done more than scare Dr. Alani Sharma. It had galvanized her. The fear, cold and absolute, burned away the last vestiges of her doubt and ignited a fire of feverish, desperate intellect. Back in her motel room, she worked with an intensity that bordered on madness. She attacked the cheap whiteboard on the wall, her marker flying as she scrawled equations, diagrams, and chemical cascades. The pieces clicked into place with the force of a physical impact. The curse and the gene, the folklore and the data, they weren't two separate stories. They were two languages describing the same horrifying thing. It wasn't supernatural, it was biological. It was a catastrophic mitochondrial dysfunction. "It is a switch," she muttered to herself, her voice hoarse, the words tumbling out, "a latent genetic switch in the Hennessy DNA. When it flips when triggered by some unknown biological stressor, it causes a runaway energy release at the cellular level." She drew a diagram of a cell, then overlaid it with equations from theoretical physics. She was combining worlds, using the rigorous language of science to describe the unbelievable. It is not a fire as we know it. It is a subatomic chain reaction, a biological firestorm. The heat is generated internally, instantaneously. It would explain the calcined bones, the lack of damage to the surroundings. She circled a formula, and the electromagnetic precursor, the static in their blood. It all fits. This was her synthesis, a new, terrifying hypothesis that honoured both the superstitious accounts of the Hennessy family and the cold, hard data from her lab. The folklore wasn't wrong. It was just the primitive, terrified first draft of a complex and horrifying scientific reality. The International Forensics Symposium was Dr. Marcus Thorne's natural habitat. He stood on the brightly lit stage, the very picture of scientific authority, basking in the adoration of his colleagues. He was untouchable, the high priest of his field. Then, during the final Q&A, a figure rose from the back of the cavernous hall. It was Dr. Alani Sharma. She looked tired, but her eyes burned with an unshakable resolve. She didn't shout. Her voice was cold, clear, and carried across the auditorium. "Dr. Thorne," she began, ignoring the moderator's attempt to stop her, "regarding anomalous thermal effects in human remains, what is your opinion on cases where bone calcination exceeds 1500 degrees Fahrenheit, yet the surrounding environment shows no evidence of a commensurate thermal event?" Thorne's smile tightened. "Dr. Sharma, I believe I've already advised you on this matter. And I have new data," she pressed on, her voice like steel. "Historical photographic evidence of a recurring pattern of these events within a specific genealogical line. A failed replication of the Wick effect under controlled conditions, and a specific, unclassified mitochondrial DNA haplotype linking every single victim." The room was silent. Thorne's face was a mask of cold fury. He was being challenged in his temple, and he would not stand for it. "What you have," he said, his voice dripping with venom, "is an obsession. You are peddling sensationalist pseudoscience based on contaminated data and rural ghost stories." He signaled to the conference security at the side of the stage. "This is a forum for science, Dr. Sharma, not for fantasy. Please escort her out." Two guards moved toward her. The humiliation was absolute. She was being cast out, publicly shamed by the man she once revered. As the guards reached her aisle, a man in the row ahead of her jumped to his feet. "Let her speak!" he shouted, his face red with indignation. "You can just dismiss her!" Sharma froze. She recognized his face from the deep dive into the Hennessy family tree. It was David Hennessy, a distant cousin of Liam S. from the city, a man she hadn't had the chance to contact yet. "Sir, please sit down," Thorne said dismissively from the stage. "No!" David shouted, growing more agitated. He took a step into the aisle, gesturing wildly. "You people think you know everything." He clutched his chest, a strange look on his face. It's hot." A collective gasp went through the rows nearest to him. A visible, crackling aura of blue static electricity, like St. Elmo's fire, enveloped his body. The air filled with the sharp, clean smell of ozone, the smell of rain on hot metal. People screamed, scrambling away, tripping over chairs. On stage, Dr. Thorne stared, his arrogance melting into a mask of pure, uncomprehending horror. David Hennessy convulsed once, his eyes wide, and then, in a silent, blinding flash of internal white light, his form imploded. For a single, horrific second, he was a silhouette against an impossible brightness, and then he was gone. He collapsed into a heap of smouldering clothes that fell onto the carpet, leaving a small pile of fine, grey ash. It happened in 3 seconds. All that remained were his shoes, sitting perfectly on the floor. Months later, Dr. Alani Sharma sat at a long, polished table in a closed-door congressional hearing room. She was composed, her voice steady, imbued with a profound new authority. She was no longer an outcast. She was the director of a new, top-secret research division, the world's only expert on a phenomenon that had rewritten the laws of biology. In the background, sitting with the other consultants, was Dr. Thorne. He looked older, smaller, his face a permanent mask of humbled awe. The phenomenon, which we are provisionally calling endogenous hyper-combustion, Sharma testified, is not supernatural. It is a terrifyingly rare genetic disorder. But the failure to identify it sooner was not a failure of science itself. It was a failure of its practitioners. She looked at each member of the committee, her gaze unwavering. We were too arrogant, too dogmatic. We refused to properly investigate evidence simply because it didn't fit our existing models. We dismissed centuries of eyewitness accounts as folklore, when in fact, it was invaluable anecdotal data that we were too blind to appreciate. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the silent room. The lesson here is one of humility. It teaches us that the line between science and superstition is not always as clear as we would like. It teaches us that sometimes the most outlandish and unbelievable stories are not lies. They are simply the first draft of a terrifying new chapter of scientific truth. What a fascinating story. It is easy to see the conclusion as a simple victory for science. Dr. Sharma, through rigorous work, replaced a spooky superstition with a terrifying biological reality. Case closed. But I think the real story is about what truth means. For generations, the Hennessy family lived with a curse they called the fire. It was their reality, a recurring trauma woven into their history. Their folklore wasn't an act of ignorance. It was a desperate attempt to name the monster that haunted them. When Dr. Sharma first arrived, her neat Wick effect theory, while scientifically sound, completely dismissed that lived experience. It explained the what, but ignored the emotional and historical why. In the end, science didn't debunk the family's story. It just gave it a new, more precise name. The final theory didn't prove the family wrong. It proved their generations of fear were justified. The science didn't erase the superstition. It just finally caught up to it. It makes you wonder about all the other things we dismiss as folklore. This story asks a fascinating question. Is a story a lie just because we don't have the science to explain it yet? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.